मेरा चैनल माया सुमरो और मीट माय लाइफ एडवेंचर। आज की इस वीडियो में हम कवर करेंगे द डिसेंडिंग ट्रैक्ट्स ऑफ द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड। सो ये एक पिक्चर है ओवरऑल द डिसेंडिंग ट्रैक्ट्स ऑफ द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड। सो दिस इज द सिंपल फॉर्म ऑफ द डिसेंडिंग मोटर पाथवे फ्रॉम द cerebral cortex to the skeletal muscle. Note that in this three neurons are involved. The first neuron, that means the first order neuron, has its cell body in the cerebral cortex. Now the axons of the first order neuron descends and synapse with the second order neuron. Now the second order neuron in the internuncial neuron situated in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. The axon of the second order neuron is short and then synapse with the third order neuron. The lower motor neuron in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. Now the axon of the third order neuron innervates the skeletal muscle through the anterior root and spinal nerve. In some instances, the axon of the first order neuron directly synapses with the third order neuron. That means in reflex arc. So this is all about the simple form of the descending motor pathway from the cerebral cortex to the muscle or skeletal muscle. इसमें 3 neurons involved होते हैं. First order neuron that synapse with the second order neuron in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. The second order neuron is short and then synapse with the third order neuron in the anterior gray column, and then the third order neuron, the axon of the third order neuron innervates the skeletal muscle. But कुछ cases में like as in reflex arc में क्या होता है, जो first order neuron directly synapse with the third order neuron. The overall descending tract का pathway. Now we will discuss each descending pathway separately. So let's move to another descending pathway. So this is the reticulospinal tract, descending tract throughout the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. Groups of scattered nerve cells and nerve fibers exist together and are collectively known as reticular formation. Then from the pons, these neurons send axons which are uncrossed and it forms the Pontine reticulospinal tract, and from the medulla oblongata, these neurons send axons which are crossed or uncrossed and it forms the medullary reticulospinal tract. The reticulospinal fibers from the pons. The reticulospinal fibers from the pons descend through the anterior white column, while those from the medulla oblongata descend in the lateral white column. So from the pons, the fiber descend in the anterior white column, medial anterior white column, while the fibers from the medulla oblongata descend in the lateral white column. Then both sets of fiber enter the anterior gray column of the spinal cord and may facilitate or inhibit the activity of the alpha and gamma motor neurons. By these means, the reticulospinal tract influence voluntary movement and reflex activity. Now, the reticulospinal fibers are also now thought to include the descending autonomic fibers. The reticulospinal tract thus provides a pathway by which the hypothalamus can control the sympathetic outflow and the sacral parasympathetic outflow. So this is reticulospinal tract throughout the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. Groups of scattered nerve cells and nerve fibers exist that are collectively known as reticular formation. From the pons, the neurons send axon and it forms the Pontine reticulospinal tract, and from the medulla oblongata, the neurons send axons which are crossed or uncrossed and it forms the medullary reticulospinal tract. जो पोन्स से एक्सॉन्स आ रहे हैं वो अनक्रोस्ड है एंड इट फॉर्म पोंटाइन रेटिकुलोस्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट. The reticulospinal fiber from the pons descend through the anterior white column, while those from the medulla oblongata descending in the lateral white column. Both of these fibers enter the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. और इसका फंक्शन क्या है? रेटिकुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट में इनहिबिट or facilitate the activity of the alpha and gamma motor neurons. By these means, the reticular spinal tract of the descending pathway, that is Rubrule tract. Rubra means red nucleus, this red nucleus, which is situated in the tegmentum of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus of the midbrain. Now the axons of the neuron in this nucleus cross the midline at the level of the nucleus and descend as the rubrospinal tract through the pons medulla oblongata to enter the lateral white column of the spinal cord. The fibers terminate by synapsing with the international neuron in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. और इसका फंक्शन क्या है? जो न्यूरॉन्स है रेड न्यूक्लियस में रिसीव करते हैं afferent impulse through connections with the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. This is believed to be an important indirect pathway by which the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum can influence the activity of alpha and gamma motor neurons of the spinal cord. The tract facilitates the activity of flexor muscles while inhibit the activity of the extensor muscles or anti-gravity muscles. So simple, rubrospinal tract क्या करता है? Facilitate करता है activity of the flexor muscles while this tract inhibit the activity of the extensor muscles. This is corticospinal tract of the descending pathway. It is believed that the fibers of the corticospinal tract arise as axons of the pyramidal cells situated in the fifth layer of the cerebral cortex. About one-third of the fibers originate from the primary motor cortex, while one in the area 4. About one-third of the fibers originate from the primary motor cortex, area 4, and one-third originate from the secondary motor cortex, area 6, and one-third originate from the parietal lobe, area 3, 1 and 2. Thus, two-thirds of the fibers arise from the precentral gyrus and one-third of the fibers arise from the postcentral gyrus. Because of the electrical stimulation of different parts of the precentral gyrus produces movement and different part of the opposite side of the body. Now the descending fibers converge in the corona radiata and then pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Here the fibers are organized so that those closest to the genu are associated or concerned with the cervical portion of the body, while those situated most posterior are concerned with the lower extremity. Now the tract continue using the middle 3/5 of the basic peduncle of the midbrain. Here the fibers are concerned with the cervical portion of the body are situated medially, while those concerned with the leg are situated laterally. Now, on entering the pons, the tract is broken into many bundles by a transverse pontocerebral fibers. Now, in the medulla oblongata, the bundles become grouped together along the anterior border to form a swelling known as pyramid, hence the alternative name pyramidal tract. At the junction of the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord, most of the fiber cross the midline at the decushion of the pyramids and enter the lateral white column of the spinal cord to form the lateral corticospinal tract. The remaining fibers do not cross and descend in the anterior white column of the spinal cord, and it forms the anterior corticospinal tract. These fibers eventually cross the midline and terminate in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord segment in the cervical and upper thoracic segment. Now the lateral corticospinal tract descends the length of the spinal cord and its fiber terminate in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord segment. Most corticospinal fibers synapse with the international neuron, which in turn synapse with the alpha motor neurons and some gamma motor neuron. Only the largest corticospinal fiber synapse directly with the motor neuron. और इस tract का function क्या है? The corticospinal tract are the pathway concerned with voluntary discrete skilled movement, especially those of the distal part of the limb. Simply corticospinal tract के जो fibers है वो first converge in the corona radiata, then pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and then it continue with the middle 3/5 of the basic peduncle of the midbrain. Here the fiber concerned with the cervical portion of the body situated medially, and those concerned with the leg are situated laterally. Now in entering the pons, entering the pons, the tract is broken into many bundles by the transverse pontocerebral tract. In the medulla oblongata, the bundles become grouped together along the anterior border to form cell known as pyramid, and the tract is known as pyramidal tract. And then at the junction of the medulla oblongata, some fibers cross the midline and decussate and descend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord, and it forms the lateral corticospinal tract, while some fibers do not cross medially or do not decussate and descend in the anterior white column of the spinal cord, and it forms the anterior corticospinal tract. So this is the site of decussation of the pyramids. So this is all about the corticospinal tract. So this is another tract, that is vestibulospinal tract. The vestibular nuclei are situated in the pons and the medulla oblongata beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. The vestibular nuclei receive afferent fibers from the inner ear through the vestibular nerve. This is vestibular nucleus are situated in the pons and the medulla oblongata beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. Now this nuclei receive afferent fibers from the ear through the vestibular nerve. ये vestibular nucleus जो कि receive करता है afferent fibers from the inner ear through the vestibular nerve and from the cerebellum. Now the neurons of the lateral vestibular nucleus give rise to the axon that form the vestibular tract. The tract descends uncrossed through the medulla oblongata and through the length of the spinal cord in the anterior white column. Descend uncrossed through the medulla oblongata and through the length of the spinal cord in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. Now these fiber terminates by synapsing with the international neuron of the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. The inner ear and the cerebellum by means of this tract facilitate the activity of the extensor muscle and inhibit the activity of the flexor muscles in association with the maintenance of balance. Rubrule-spinal tract में क्या था कि वो facilitate कर रहा था the activity of extensor flexor muscles while inhibit the activity of the extensor muscle, but in this vestibulospinal tract it inhibit the activity of the flexor muscles while facilitate the activity of the extensor muscles. So ये vice versa है इसके function. Rubrule-spinal tract और vestibulospinal tract के functions जो है वो vice versa है. So this is olivospinal tract. There is no considerable doubt as to the existence of this tract as a separate pathway. So this tract was thought to arise from the inferior olivary nucleus, and its axon descend and the lateral anterior white column of the spinal cord to influence the activity of the motor neurons in the anterior gray column. There is no considerable doubt that it may exist or not. So इसके जो nucleus axons है वो arise होंगे from the inferior olivary nucleus and to descend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord just to inhibit or influence the activity of the motor neurons in the anterior gray column. This figure shows the tectospinal tract. इस tract के जो fibers हैं वो arise होंगे from the nerve cells in the superior colliculus of the midbrain. Most of the fibers cross the midline and descend through the brainstem close to the medial longitudinal fasciculum. So most of the fibers cross the midline soon after origin and descend through the stem close to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The tectospinal tract descend through the anterior white column of the spinal cord and close to the anterior median fissure. The majority of the fibers terminate in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord in the upper cervical segment by synapsing with internuclear neuron. These fibers are believed to be concerned with the reflex postural movement in response to the visual stimuli CI. Simply tectospinal tract के जो एक्सोन्स है नर्व सेल से वो अराइज होंगे फ्रॉम द सुपीरियर कॉलिकुलस ऑफ द मिड ब्रेन और इसके जो फाइबर्स हैं वो क्रॉस करेंगे मिड लाइन को जैसे ही वो ओरिजिन होंगे and then these axons descend through the anterior white column of the spinal cord and then the majority of fiber terminate होंगे in the anterior gray column in the upper cervical segment of the spinal cord by synapsing with the internuclear neuron in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. और ये जो फाइबर है वो रिफ्लेक्स करेंगे मोस्टली मूवमेंट इन रेस्पॉन्स टू विजुअल स्टिमुलाई. So guys, this is all about the descending pathway जिसमें Rubrule tract, vestibular spinal tract, tactospinal tract, corticospinal tract, olivaryspinal. So this is the summary of whole corticospinal tract. First of all, this tract arises from the pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex. Fibers nerve travel through the corona radiata, then posterior limb of the internal capsule, then cerebral peduncle, that is middle one, 3 or 5 section, then pons, then medulla oblongata, pass through the pyramids, and eventually fiber cross the midline and terminate on, and it forms the lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract of the spinal cord segments respectively. Or this is also the summary of the Rubrospinal tract. Rubrule means इसके जो nerve cells हैं वो red nucleus में होंगे और red nucleus कहाँ present होगा? At the level of the tegment of the midbrain, at the level of the superior colliculus of the midbrain. ठीक, उसके जो nerve fibers हैं या axons हैं cross करेंगे midline को and descend as Rubrospinal tract through pons and then medulla oblongata and then terminate at the anterior gray column of the spinal cord. और इसका फंक्शन क्या, ये क्या करेगा? फैसिलिटेट करेगा एक्टिविटी ऑफ द फ्लेक्सर मसल्स और इट आल्सो इनहिबिट द एक्टिविटी ऑफ द एक्सटेंसर मसल्स. दिस इज आल्सो द समरी ऑफ द टेक्टोस्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट. इसके जो नर्व सेल्स हैं वो प्रेजेंट होंगे सुपीरियर कॉलिकुलस ऑफ द मिड ब्रेन. इसके जो एक्सोन से क्रॉस करेंगे मिड लाइन को, डिसेंड करेंगे क्लोज टू द मीडियल लॉन्गिट्यूडिनल fasciculus. उसके बाद वो टर्मिनेट होंगे इन द इंटीरियर ग्रे कॉलम ऑफ द अपर सर्वाइकल सेगमेंट और इसका जो फंक्शन है वो क्या है? रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर रिफ्लेक्स मूवमेंट ऑफ हेड नेक इन रिस्पॉन्स टू विजुअल स्टिमुलाई. सो दिस इज अनदर ट्रैक्ट, वेस्टिबुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट. इसके जो नर्व सेल्स वो प्रेजेंट होंगे वेस्टिबुलर न्यूक्लियस. देखो ट्रैक्ट के नेम से पता चलता है कि इसके जो नर्व सेल्स हैं वो कहाँ पर सिचुएटेड होंगे. जैसे रूब्रो था तो रेड न्यूक्लियस के पास, अब ये जैसे वेस्टिबुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट है तो उसके जो नर्व सेल्स है वो कहाँ पर होंगे? वेस्टिबुलर न्यूक्लियस. इन द पोन्स एंड मेडुला ऑब्लोंगेटा वो रिसीव करेंगे फाइबर्स इनर ईयर से थ्रू वेस्टिबुलर नर्व एंड आल्सो फ्रॉम द सेरिबलम. और उसके जो एक्सोन है वो डिसेंड करेंगे इज अनक्रोज्ड थ्रू मेडुला ऑब्लोंगेटा थ्रू द लेंथ ऑफ द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड and finally synapse with neuron जो कि present होगा anterior gray column of the spinal cord में. और this tract का जो function है वो balance by facilitate the activity of the extensor muscles. उसके बाद reticular spinal tract है. इसके जो nerve cells हैं कहाँ पर होंगे? in reticular formation. ठीक, और रेटिकुलर फॉर्मेशन कैसे बनेगा? बाय द सेल्स ऑफ द पोन्स, मेडुला ऑब्लोंगेटा एंड द मिड ब्रेन. इन तीनों को कंबाइन करके इट फॉर्म्स द रेटिकुलर फॉर्मेशन. और उसके जो फाइबर्स है वो पास होंगे फ्रॉम द मिड ब्रेन, पोन्स, मेडुला ऑब्लोंगेटा और एंड होगा एट द एंटीरियर ग्रे कॉलम ऑफ द स्पाइनल कॉर्ड. or it controls the activity of the motor neurons, and it also influences voluntary movement and reflex activity. और इसी ट्रैक्ट में हमारे पास पोंटाइन रेटिकुलर ट्रैक्ट भी बनता है और मेडुलरी रेटिकुलर ट्रैक्ट भी बनता है। जो फाइबर्स पोन से निकलते हैं वो अनक्रॉस होते हैं और वो बनाते हैं पोंटाइन रेटिकुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट, और जो मेडुला ऑब्लिंगेटा से फाइबर्स आते हैं वो या तो क्रॉस होते हैं या मे बी अनक्रॉस्ड, एंड इट फॉर्म्स द मेडुलरी रेटिकुलर स्पाइनल ट्रैक्ट। और इसका फंक्शन क्या है? इट इन्फ्लुएंस द वॉलंटरी मूवमेंट एंड रिफ्लेक्स एक्टिविटी। इट आल्सो कंट्रोल द एक्टिविटी ऑफ द मोटर न्यूक्लियस। कोई भी क्वेरी हो, काइंडली ask in the comment section box, or do not forget to subscribe my channel as Maria Sumro or Meet My Life Adventure. Okay, bye. Allah Hafiz. Take care.